Welcome, everybody. My name is Jessica Shortall. Thank you so much for joining this panel called Lean In for the Win. We're going to be talking about how and why companies engage in public policy advocacy on LGBTQ discrimination and non-discrimination issues. So before we do screen share, figure to be a little more personable, to see everyone's faces, and just would ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into it. So I'll just go in order of what I can see on my screen. Since most popular panelist award goes to Sam Slate.
Hi, I'm Sam Slate, he, him, his. I work for Dell. I reside in Austin, Texas. I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with Jessica in these efforts now for a couple of years, and y'all are really in for a treat today. I'm honored to be on this panel with Meredith and Lisa. So. Thanks for joining us. I'm a veteran father to a 15-year-old daughter, book geek, theater geek, trans man, and and founded the Trans Task Force, co-founded the Trans Task Force at Dell. So looking forward to catching up with you today.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, over to Meredith.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Meredith Singer. I am in IBM's Government and Regulatory Affairs function based out of Washington, D.C. I am so excited to be on this panel with all of my colleagues today. And in my day job, I'm responsible for managing lobbying and advocacy before the federal Congress, as well as federal agencies, and in some cases, state governments too, on human resources policy issues. So diversity and inclusion, immigration reform, labor and employment, and issues like that. And so excited to be able to share with you some of the work that I and my IBM colleagues have been doing on behalf of the LGBT+ community, both at the state and at the federal level today. Thank you.
Thanks, Meredith. And now over to Lisa Manley.
All right. Hello, everybody. Great to be a part of this conversation. Lisa Manley. I am the Vice President of Sustainability at Mars. I head up our social sustainability agenda, which means the work that we do globally on human rights, gender, and income and wages as well. I live in Washington, D.C. with my wife and dog. I am, ironically, I suppose, at the moment in the basement of my parents' home in Georgia. So hopefully they will stay up while I stay down for this conversation. We'll see. They don't really get the virtual work experience.
I would welcome a video bomb from them. We may see my dog Willie here, so I think all bets are off. Thank you all. I just can't say how grateful I am to have you all here, and in general, the companies and you individually are such wonderful allies over the years. And I think sometimes that isn't always seen out in public, which is why I'm so excited to do this session and talk about all of the work that companies are doing both in public and very much behind the scenes. So I'm Jessica Shortall. I wear two very similar hats. So I run two business coalitions focused on LGBTQ non-discrimination. One is called America Competes, and I run that coalition for Freedom for All Americans, the national bipartisan campaign for non-discrimination. And the other is called Texas Competes, which is a program of Equality Texas, both making the business and economic and human cases for non-discrimination. So I'm a bit of a data nerd, and I live outside the Twin Cities with my husband, Clay, and my two distance learning children who are not in the house today, thank goodness, and my dog, Willie Nelson. Okay, so, because once a Texan, always a Texan. We are going to go to screen share, and I'm going to do a great job of this. I just note, hang on. Okay, can I get a thumbs up from one of my co-panelists that this is actually working? Okay, wonderful, thank you. Okay, so we've done our introductions. Please, Marilou from Mountain Equal, thank you for hosting us and helping us. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if you've got questions, there's a Q&A function, I think. Because we really would love to be able to have discussion with you. Okay, I see Marilou unmuting, so I'm going to pause.
Yes, I was going to say they can either submit questions under the polling tab on Pathable or here through the Zoom chat.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks, Marilou. Okay, so quick agenda for today. We're just going to I'll do like a little history lesson. I did mention that I'm a nerd. recap of where we've been in the past few years on discrimination and non-discrimination in the LGBTQ space when it comes to public policy, and then how businesses have engaged there. That'll touch at the same time a little bit on where we think we're headed in states and at the federal level in the United States. So I know we have folks here from other countries outside of the US. Welcome. A lot of this applies in terms of the tactics that businesses can employ, but a little bit of apologies in advance that this is a little bit America-centric in terms of talking about what's going on right now. And then we'll just have a discussion, and our panelists here will talk about the role of business coalitions, the public and private things that their businesses engage in, and what goes into making those decisions, because it can be quite complex for a big business to make decisions to take steps on any issue. And then we'll talk about what you all can do. I see a raised hand, and I don't know what that means. So Mary Lou, can you help us with that?
Can you repeat that?
I got a little notification that someone had raised their hand.
Oh, that just means that if you want to allow them to talk, you can. They might have a question. You can just chat it to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you all mind, because I'm not positive I'll be able to manage that with 379 attendees, would you all mind putting those questions into chat and also into the Pathable thing? And if you are having technical difficulties, to do that as well. So hopefully Marilu can help us troubleshoot. We are grateful to you for being here. Does that sound all right? Okay, all right. So, okay, I'm just going to do a little brief history of what we've seen in the past few years in this space. So this is a look at state legislatures, but I think it's really illustrative because these are often the incubators for discriminatory legislation, certainly, and they have also been the incubators, as we've seen, for marriage equality and for non-discrimination legislation. So this is a rough total of all explicitly anti-LGBTQ bills that have been filed in state legislatures across the 50 United States. So here in the US, we have our federal government, and then each state has its own legislature that can make laws relating just to that state. So we'll just do a little bit of a history lesson that Obergefell, that's our United States Supreme Court marriage equality decision, happened in 2015. And if you see these red chunks here, these are religious exemption bills by volume. So we've seen many very broad bills that would essentially allow people to ignore or disobey non-discrimination laws by claiming that they have a religious motivation in doing so. And then we have seen some very targeted bills that would allow, for example, doctors to refuse healthcare to an LGBTQ person, or child welfare agencies to refuse to place a foster child with loving LGBTQ inclusive family. So as a reaction to the marriage equality decision, we have seen this huge surge over this 2015, 16, 17 of these types of bills as a kind of, okay, fine, I guess, same-sex couples are going to get married, but there are a whole bunch of things that we shouldn't have to do to treat same-sex married couples in the same way as we treat different sex married couples. So we saw these have largely failed. Some have passed in state legislatures, but we're seeing it migrate a little bit toward more focus on the Supreme Court. But we did see this big volume. Okay, and then we saw a shift over time. In 2016 and 2017, we have what I sort of jokingly, sadly refer to as the bathroom wars, where we had dozens of bills filed in each of these 2 years in state legislatures that would have barred transgender people from using public restrooms, sometimes in schools, sometimes in all public places, and subjected them to really privacy invading measures in order to just go about their daily lives. So we saw in North Carolina pass a bill in 2016, which had a huge business response, tourism and corporate response. And then in Texas, we spent an entire year fighting a bathroom bill, and we were ultimately successful in that due to a lot of factors, trans people and their families speaking up, but certainly the business community had a major impact on that. Ian is asking, is most of this legislation distributed pretty evenly among US regions? We do see these bills filed in all kinds of states in terms of which party dominates the state government, but of course they really do only move in states where the legislature is Republican dominated. But I will say that 95% of these bills have died. So it's really important to note that they have also been killed by Republican dominated legislatures. And that doesn't happen without bipartisan participation. So the picture is not always as dire as it can seem. So this became kind of, this bathroom thing became the new winning argument, or at least that was the attempt. It was like, okay, we've tried these religious things. They aren't getting the traction we want to see. And so we see this attempt to say, okay, maybe if we just target trans people, that will be a more winning argument. But these have all died. I mean, the North Carolina bill has been partly amended. Texas did not pass its bill. So this big emergency that we were presented with, saying, you know, that we have an emergency in bathrooms, spiked and then died. For the most part, you can see some bathroom bills being filed, but for the most part, for now, some of these things can be zombies and come back, but for now it seems to have dropped. So then 2018, 2019 is what I think of as the regrouping year. I imagine these tend to be coordinated with some big national organizations putting resources behind them. So I sort of imagine these, without knowing for sure, as a kind of head scratching, what should we do next? You know, these tactics aren't working. You can see that there's still energy in this red block behind these religious exemption bills. That's still happening, so it hasn't gone away. And a focus of bringing those issues targeting transgender people to the Supreme Court. So we've seen a few Supreme Court cases, including one that will be heard this fall called Fulton versus the City of Philadelphia, that are focused on religious exemptions or religious refusals. I'm just trying to keep up with the chat, but not all of it will, we won't get to all of it right away. Thank you for enjoying my nerdy slide. Okay, so then we have the Equality Act, which is federal non-discrimination legislation. So this is legislation that includes sexual orientation and gender identity, and comprehensive non-discrimination protections in housing, employment, and public spaces, passed just the US House. So it's not law, it hasn't passed the Senate, it hasn't been signed by the president, but it did pass one chamber of of Congress for the first time. And so I think that has upped the urgency for these folks to figure out, what is our winning argument? What can we use to claw back the support for non-discrimination? We also, around this same time, saw Virginia become the 21st state in America to pass a fully comprehensive, fully inclusive non-discrimination law. And then we saw the Supreme Court's Bostock decision, which has extended employment non-discrimination protections to LGBTQ people as part of federal law, and probably will result in further protections too in things like housing. So, you know, these are wins for LGBTQ non-discrimination. And then we have, as we continue to have, as we saw back here with Obergefell, a response. So the newest response that we are seeing is this big wave of bills filed in state legislatures that are specifically, narrowly, and quite cruelly attacking transgender youth children. So there are two types of bills. Some would ban transgender students from participating in youth sports, which is super important for their health and well-being, as it is for any kid, like my kids. And then bills that would criminalize the provision of health care to transgender minors, specifically transition-related care. So some of those would put doctors and nurses in jail, and some others would target the parents of transgender children. So this is kind of the story of where we've been so far with public policy in the United States. And I just thought I would pause for a second to ask our panelists, you know, if you could weigh in at all to what this has been like, and what, you know, what it has meant for your businesses and what it means going forward. Y'all are muted.
All right, I'm happy to take the first crack at this, and thank you so much. I love this slide too, and when Jessica developed it, I said, yes, 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 this is like a fantastic illustration of what it is that we have been fighting. You know, our own involvement from an external perspective at IBM really did kick off back in that 2015, 2016 timeframe as a result of Obergefell, as well as really the North Carolina legislation, the early bathroom bill fight there in North Carolina. And then it quickly ramped up and picked up steam in 2017 with the Texas bathroom bill fight. So this chart really, to me, speaks volumes, because it's the timeline of my own company's involvement, my personal involvement in our advocacy. And I would say that from this point forward, our activity has just been going on an upward trajectory in terms of our involvement in lobbying, in the court fights, and in working together with our peers to try and change the narrative around the country.
Yeah, and I'll jump in as well. So I was a consultant during the 2015, 16, 17 time, working with a number of big companies that did weigh in on some of the issues that we see in this fabulous chart. Joined Mars in 2018, and we've been very actively involved in advocacy, both on our own and through the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, which is an advocacy group of Mars, Unilever, Nestle, and Danone that's coming together to stand together on behalf of the Equality Act and the SCOTUS-Bostock opinion. And also, for Mars, where we are headquartered in McLean, Virginia, we've also been super active in some of the Virginia activities as well.
For my part, my perspective on this, I think about the conversation, like I think about the number of conversations that have happened as these trends happened over the years, right? So the conversations we were having about were we all getting together and going to the State House to lobby, and doing that as coalition partners, and seeing folks from a variety of ERGs or BRGs in the tech sector in the Austin area showing up at the Capitol to have these conversations and to share stories, right? And that's what for me, that's what this, I mean, I started my transition in 2016. So, the year that was off the top. So this is like very personal from
Sam, I
my
didn't
point of
know
view.
that.
Right. And it's it's been a journey of really understanding how to unlock those conversations and have employees feel comfortable sharing with their company. Like that's part of what your ERG is, right? I think companies, maybe when we first started, ERGs or employee resource groups were a way to get ourselves together to have resources for the employees. I view it in a little bit of a different angle. I view our Pride ERG as a resource to Dell. And I think that that conversation has to work both ways. And that's when it's really powerful, is when you have bills that are moving locally, municipally, state-wise, or nationally, to be able to report to your company the impact that it has on you as an employee. When you're thinking about whether you can navigate going to the office or going somewhere to visit a customer, and do you have to navigate a bathroom issue because of where you're visiting or where your customer is, like that can impact the bottom line of business, right? That impacts your mental health and your well-being. And that's a point of intersection that is really important for you as an employee, and you as an ERG member, and you as an ERG leader, and you as an ERG executive sponsor, to understand how to connect those dots between what is happening from a legislative perspective and how that pays into your corporate result, your company results, from both the health and well-being of your employees, as well as their capacity to execute the mission day in and day out.
I'm sure I'm not muted. I just want to say, as the kind of wrangler and person that looks across businesses and works to keep business folks informed about what's going on, because as you can see, it's a lot, and a lot for business folks who have other things on their plate to follow. So that's kind of our job and my job. It has been really incredible to watch these three businesses and people and many other businesses, I'm sure many of your employers, really understand and contribute to the business case, because they see it every day about how bad this discrimination is, and the patchwork of some states with non-discrimination laws and some without, how bad that is for business, but then also to really over time engage with the human and more heavily lean into the human damage that this type of rhetoric and legislation does to people, to their employees, to the children of their employees, and to just people. And so it's been really heartwarming to see, and I think something that business community should be really proud of. So a little bit of the why here, and I promise I'll stop talking too soon. But this is a 2019 poll. PRRI is a group that looks at the intersection of religion and American values, And they do regular polling on support for non-discrimination legislation, specifically LGBTQ non-discrimination. And this is what it looks like across the 50 states. It is well above 50% across all 50 states. You know, I'm a Texas sort of centric person. Even Texas is 70% support, and that includes majorities in both major parties. So despite the headlines and the, you know, kind of sheer volume of legislation, most people don't want this discriminatory stuff, and most people agree that LGBTQ people, like everybody, should be able to participate in their communities and work hard and earn a living, put a roof over their family's head without fear of discrimination. And so a lot of this discriminatory legislation is a reaction to that, an attempt to erode and claw back so much of this progress that has been made over time. So just a little bit about, you know, just a little more context of, we'll go very quickly through this, but, you know, so Texas, we had a big bathroom bill fight. Every 2 years we have some big fight in Texas. You know, IBM and other big companies were very vocal in their opposition to and made a business case there and a human case. So you can see this would discriminate against transgender children and harm Texas recruiting. And those two things are twinned. And we tend to see the most impactful statements from businesses when they twin those two things, center the harm on people and also talk about how it's bad for business. That is something that can really build a bipartisan bridge in conversation. In Texas in 2019, we saw big tech companies, including Dell, warn legislators about a bill that would have allowed for medical healthcare discrimination against LGBTQ people and against religious minorities. In Tennessee, we had Mars and its fellow companies in the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance and many, many other businesses, dozens of others, reach out about a bill which now has become law that in Tennessee will allow child welfare agencies to refuse, even though they take tax dollars, to refuse to place children with LGBTQ inclusive families. We've had 40 companies sign a big national letter saying in any state that these bills that target trans children, that's bad for business. And then of course, on the positive side, we've had a lot, dozens upon hundreds, in fact, 206 businesses signed a friend of the court brief on the Bostock decision, saying that LGBTQ people should be protected from employment discrimination. And we've got many, many businesses, sorry, I forget the number, but that have joined HRC's coalition, business coalition supporting the Equality Act. So that is a federal non-discrimination bill. I'll just pause again in case you all want to comment on that, but otherwise after that, we'll jump into conversations, just sort of setting the stage. The last thing I'll say here is that, you know, like I've mentioned this, but what we hear a lot from businesses is that there's a talent issue. So you can imagine if you have a business that operates across multiple states and multiple countries, and you have an employee who is either part of the LGBTQ community or has a family member, a child, a partner, a parent that they are a caregiver for, that they may hesitate to, if you need to move them across state lines or from one country to another into the United States, for example, that they may hesitate to stay in a place or to move to a place where they feel that they or their loved ones may be discriminated against. And so we do see talent impacts there of the fact that some states have non-discrimination laws and others do not. We see a lot of tourism impacts, most, you know, in a pre-COVID world, and then again, someday in a post-COVID world, most major convention and meeting contracts, which are big, big business for states, have now since 2016, since the bathroom wars, have included a clause in their contract that if the host state passes an anti-LGBTQ law, they can just cancel that contract with no penalty whatsoever. So as we're coming out of COVID and the 50 states in the United States are fighting like hell against each other to win tourism business as tourism comes back, which we know has been one of the most hardest hit industries, no state can afford the kind of mark against their record of going, are we going to have to deal with another discriminatory law? So those non-discrimination laws at the state level are a really powerful competitive tool in states, and certainly not, you know, making that harmonized across the country would make that a lot easier for everybody. Okay, so we're going to get into discussion now and hear from our panelists more, and I'm excited to stop talking about approaches to business engagement. So if y'all would just, you know, chime in, I'll put myself on mute for a bit. We'll talk first about the more private actions that we have seen companies take, executives in companies as well as Pride group and ERG members.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in here. So, I mean, I think the thing to me that is fascinating is that, we're going to talk some about, the public acts, which are the things that we oftentimes see and read about, but there's an enormous amount of engagement that happens behind the scenes, that happens quietly, through phone calls, through dinners when we used to go to dinner together, and through lobbying as well. And some of these examples are reflected here on the slide. But I can say certainly from a Mars perspective that we spend a good amount of time thinking about who our stakeholders are in places of influence, and working those channels in a quiet, behind the scenes way. Whether again, it's phone calls and emails, individually, or with a number of us, or a number of us sit on various boards, and we can work through our boards or through other organizations for influence. So don't underestimate the power of some of these quieter non-public approaches. They really do make a difference.
And I'll jump in and say that there is a lot of also behind the scenes homework that we do before we decide any kind of external facing action we're going to take. I will tell you that really back in 2015, when we were fighting in North Carolina, we didn't know really what we were doing. We had for quite a long time at IBM, we had our corporate diversity, non-discrimination policy, but up to that point, we had not used it in an external way. And for us, our kind of the inflection point was the fact that in North Carolina, we have the second largest number of IBMers of any state in the country. The third largest state by population for us is Texas. So that'll probably give you an indication as to why we jumped in really with 2 full feet and on both legs in Texas. But it started off with my function, government relations, talking together with our HR diversity department, as well as our corporate legal department. And within corporate legal, we're fortunate enough to have a separate part that's just HR legal. So we had specific lawyers whose job it was to look at D&I related legal compliance. And so between the 3 of us, together with our corporate communications team, we started having multiple times a day discussions about how we were going to react, and what we would say, and what were we, if we had to evaluate what we were hearing from not just employees within North Carolina, but also our clients and customers. And because of the fact that we had so many people there, we also have a tremendously large building and facility in Research Triangle Park, which houses every business unit, and we bring in a lot of clients and customers into that unit. So we started hearing from a lot of different stakeholders, and that's what really got us having these, I'd say, courageous conversations, if I'm going to borrow a term of art used a lot right now, about what were we going to do that was different from what we had done before.
We do have a question here from Christian asking, how do you take those behind the scene engagement strategies and use them in your inclusion storytelling to your employees and stakeholders? I mean, I can give one example that Dell has invited me a couple times to their HQ to talk with members of the ERG and say, this is what we've done together. This is how we've, you may not have seen all of it, but this is what's going on. But I wonder, from the 3 of you, are you doing other things to let your folks know what you're doing behind the scenes and privately?
Yeah, I'll say that we determined kind of early on, again, first with North Carolina and then with Texas, that it was important to have communication go out on our internal website from our Chief Diversity Officer, from our Senior Vice President for Human Resources, and eventually came out from our Chairman and CEO as well, because we wanted individuals to know, since we were getting flooded by questions, that we heard what they were asking of us and that we were kind of figuring it out. We didn't have it all mapped out in terms of what we were going to be doing in every case, but we wanted them to know that at least we heard that they wanted us as a company to engage.
Yeah, I think it's important to know your audience, and it can be a frustrating type of an engagement. So I think of it as um, what's the goal? Like what do we need and what do we want? And then, it's about the business case. So if you're talking internally, if you're a person who is being impacted and you want to, find someone who to share your story with, whether it's raising it up through your ERG, whether it's your business unit leader. I tend to go for someone who has important letters behind their name: VP, SVP, GM, right? To share my story and how it's impacting me, and then to understand and ask those questions. Are we having conversations with government affairs? Are we having conversations with public relations? Is comms involved? Will you share with me, and then can I share with people who are my constituents or my peers or my ERG team members, how, what the plan is? And sometimes we can't share, and that's just the way that it is, right? Like we are in business, and I'm from the service, right? There's a need to know classification, and so I get that. And the story that we tell internally may be different than what we share when we go to visit with a legislator, right? Or with someone else, because it's if you want to make an impact on a legislator who, leads, is elected from a conservative leaning district. Well, what does that legislator care about? Like what matters to his constituency? What story can you give him to replace the narrative? What story can you give he or she or they, the story to replace the narrative that women won't be safe in bathrooms, right? So what is the alternative to that? The alternative story can be anything from we have this employee base, or we have this tax base, or we had this company wants to relocate or grow their business, and in order to grow that business, we want to be able to attract that talent. And that, so it's a combination of strategy and understanding that sometimes it feels like you're biting your tongue because it's so frustrating to not be able to tell a human story. But sometimes a human story, it's hearts and minds, and sometimes it's business impact. And so considering that in your approach, I found is super important and helpful from a if you're not the person who has merited this position to be the face of the lobbying effort for your company, how do you navigate those conversations internally to understand them, and how do you influence them in a way that feels right and important and connected?
Yeah, I think I'll also add too that, if I think about our efforts in Texas, it really began with myself and my state government relations and my corporate social responsibility colleague who was living in Austin at the time. The three of us directly joining our business partners and sitting in on meetings and getting briefed on the status of legislation. And then in some cases, we were going to visit with state legislators, just ourselves. This was before we involved anybody from our business resource group or before we started really calling in the big guns, because we wanted to understand what the counter arguments were. We wanted to hear in a non-threatening way from the legislators that we were trying to lobby. We wanted to understand what the opposition was saying. And it was only after learning that and being able to assess what we had learned, having had the experience we did, seeing that none of us was going to get our head chopped off by going into some of these conservative offices, that we then felt more comfortable, I'd say, expanding the tent. And then it eventually got to the point, which at least in Texas, by the summertime in the special session of that year in 2017, that we very much engaged our business resource group leaders as well as allies, as well as our state IBM site leadership to walk the halls of the state capitol in Austin. So it took a while. Again, it was kind of a steady trajectory of increasing activity and involving more people and becoming a lot more public.
Just a tiny build there, because I think what Meredith is saying about the importance of that early homework is so important. Sometimes it may feel at the beginning stages of some of these advocacy initiatives that we're moving too slowly, but we're really just trying to get a sense of sort of what's the situational assessment, where can we move, how can we move, with whom can we move. But once you get sort of your position aligned and you do that early homework, I think what we find is that you can really pick up speed and pace and impact as things move along, which makes me hopeful, thinking about, Jessica's chart, as we move into 2021, which we're going to talk more about, I think that there's a lot of homework has been done on these issues. And, I'm hopeful that we're all going to be able to move at a much more significant pace and with a lot more alignment on many of these issues.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing too, that for many of us, this period of 2017 in Texas was the first time that a lot of our companies went so public and became so engaged from a lobbying perspective. And it did stretch over the course of a good 8 months. But having learned the lessons we did and having achieved the success that we did, that model of engagement now has become the template that we are using in all kinds of states and at the federal level. So, a lot of times, whether if it's a new issue like working on childhood adoption or working on transgender athletes at the high school or the K through 12 level or something else that may not directly seem like it has a direct business impact, we really have to not necessarily rush so fast into wanting to go from 0 to 60. But once we are able to develop that template and it works, then rest assured, we're going to leverage the heck out of it as we go forward and work on other issues.
Just to build on all of that, I think that slow build is so important. I mean, I'm cognizant every single day that every business has this broad legislative agenda. So the things that they need to get accomplished in the legislative session in a state, in every state they operate, and in Congress. And those things affect their ability to keep people employed and, write everyone's paycheck. And so they need to achieve those things, even if they are not, they're not in the LGBTQ lane. They're about labor laws and tariffs and, whatever affects each individual industry. And they have to accomplish all of those things. I mean, that's how you stay in business, right? And turn a profit and be able to pay people. And so business folks have to balance all of that and go, how do we enter this new issue area in a way that is impactful, doesn't slam the door on us, which will hurt the rest of our legislative agenda and will hurt our ability to have any effectiveness on this issue. So if we had come roaring out of the gate on the Texas bathroom bill, pointing fingers and shouting at folks and what have you, then the business voice would have lost its power altogether. So it requires a lot of discipline, and sometimes it can feel slow, but it builds much better allies over time among the business community and then with lawmakers who are willing to listen because they don't feel attacked. And I said this in the chat, but like it or not, nobody responds well when they feel they're being called a bigot. Nobody. I've never found a single person on earth who responds well to that, even when it's true. So, or especially maybe when it's true. And so we have to go about this from a completely different perspective of, and the easiest door opener is saying, here's how this would affect our business. And we know that you care about business and jobs. And that can then slowly open a path to all kinds of other conversations about people's team members and their kids and their families, where you have much more open and receptive ears to all of that. I do see a question from Jessica L saying, how do you get your ERG members and leaders in to talk to the lobbyists the corporation uses? So I think if I'm understanding this question, is like, how do you get access to the folks that are doing the lobbying? Because we have here, have ERG members join the lobbyists. How do you make that happen?
It has to happen in a coordinated way under the direction, at least in IBM's case, of government and regulatory affairs and HR legal. We, within our business conduct guidelines that everybody signs off on every year within my company recognizes that our government affairs function is the representative of the company before all elected officials. And so we do ask and really require people to work through us because it's not always appropriate. But one of the things that I know we're probably going to talk about more is how to get each of you as members of ERGs more engaged. And I think it really starts with talking to your ERG leadership if you yourself are not the leader, talking with your HR leader, talking with an executive sponsor if your group has one, and reaching out to your government affairs function if you have one. And so it's just really critical that, and I'm speaking because speaking from the perspective of the federal lobbyist here, that you don't just go off on your own because it could really upset the agenda and the work in progress that the company is trying to achieve and the way that it's trying to go about achieving it.
And we will, you're right, Meredith, on the next slide, we'll get to a little bit more of that. So maybe pausing that for a second. I'm just going to read from the chat. Our good friend, Nikki Gibson at Dell says, Dell has a great training we host for team members and we partner with local organizations to participate in their lobby day events. So that may be in individual states, for example. So a lot of the, state equality organizations will have a lobby day, and you can get involved as a private citizen as long as, as Meredith says, you're not saying that you speak for your company. And then sometimes companies will support that and say, yep, we're having our Dell employees participate in the equality, wherever it is, lobby day. So it just sort of varies from company to company. So we will, Megan has a question, and I think Megan will get to this on the next slide. If your company's anti-political involvement, what's your recommendation for approaching these advocacy initiatives? So if we'll just pause on that for a second and move to some of the more public actions that businesses take. And these are the ones that you're more likely to see. And then so make the headlines that we saw a minute ago. And so I'll just run through these very quickly. They're very different. So join press conferences, business coalitions like the two that I run, especially in Texas, will hold a press conference of business leaders, and some businesses will send executives to speak at them, where we make that business case and stick very much to that business line and talk about why inclusion and a welcoming state is so important. Signed on to an amicus brief. This is, you also hear this referred to as a friend of the court brief. So for the Supreme Court, for example, when it's considering an issue, all kinds of groups get together and have lawyers write and sign a brief saying, we hope you'll rule this way or that way on this issue, and here's why. So we at Freedom for All Americans work with HRC and Out and Equal and other big organizations to get businesses together onto these friend of the court briefs. And what I'm sure our folks will talk about this, what tends to happen is everybody writes to us and says, well, who has signed already? And so I've gotten to the point where I'll go, everyone's asking me that, so can you be first, please? And then I can tell everyone else, and then they'll come in. And so it's a sort of a strength in numbers thing, which we can talk about. Social media, certainly, and coalitions like ours can prep businesses with social media. Sign an op-ed or open letter. So I write a lot of those, or ghostwrite, or write talking points for them, and coalitions can help pitch and place those both in local and national papers. And very important to strike that business tone so that it's in line with the kind of whole messaging. Take out an ad. We saw IBM take out full page ads during the bathroom bill fight in Texas, and that on its own made major news. And then join or create a coalition, which I have a little asterisk because we're going to just pause that because we'll talk about it in a second. So would you all mind chiming in on this, any one of these kind of popcorn style of what it takes to get these kinds of things done? Because these are harder, frankly. The public facing stuff, you have to kind of decide where you're going to spend your political capital and get sign off internally and all those great corporate things that are just kind of the nature of the thing.
So I'll jump in, and I think we've talked a little bit about some of the ingredients here. So like what makes any of these things possible? We look first at what's the issue. We look at the relevancy of the issue to business and to our employees. We look at whether our voice can matter. We look at whether we've got friends and fellow industry folks that are signed on, and we also look at and we want to understand sort of who's on the other side, and then it's going to matter. Timing is going to matter. who is being asked to engage. It's always going to take a heck of a lot longer if we're trying to get a CEO engaged, or with Mars, which is a family-owned company, a member of the family to engage. Generally, the social media components are a little bit easier to sort of move quickly, and partners that are really trying to make it easier for business. And Jessica knows this because she does it well. Will share stuff with us that we can just sort of read and repeat. The things like op-eds and open letters, I think there is a power and a utility to those, and there is also a point where they reach saturation. And there are some issues where there are days and weeks where I think, oh God, not another one of these, because we do try to take every one of them quite seriously. We do review them and think about them and convene meetings to discuss them and parse over every word and every paragraph. They are more difficult to reach alignment. And so, I think that we probably are rather judicious in the way that we allow ourselves to focus there.
Yeah, I'll chime in to Lisa's point on social media. That definitely is, I think, the easiest avenue as a company for us to express our position. And quite frankly, what we've done in certain places where we felt uncomfortable being critical or calling out a country or a state legislature or an issue, what we've been able to do with our Twitter handle, for example, is just to restate our affirmative position in favor of non-discrimination. So we can kind of get at the same end goal in a slightly, less less pointed way, so to speak. And this is something that we are doing quite a bit more outside of the United States now, where, in certain countries, we don't want to put our employees at risk. But yet we want to be able to express the fact that we support non-discrimination protection. So whether it's in Hungary or Poland or countries like that. So the social media piece can be a really important tool if your company has its own policy handle, or if your diversity and inclusion department, HR department, has its own social media handles, whether it be on Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook. I think that's a great place to start. And certainly as your ERG, you may have your own, and as long as you've got, you've got the ability to use it for public purposes, that's a great place for you to begin. But to Lisa's point, the sign-on letters, they just give us agita, I think, because we do literally have to get so many different parts of the company to sign off on it. And then when we need a signatory, as opposed to just putting the company name on it, oh my God, it's just a real pain in the neck. And unless there's critical mass with a lot of companies or a lot of CEOs, for example, on the letter, we don't really think that it's going to have a lot of utility. I will say too, though, there's nothing stopping each of you from individually writing your representatives, either at the state or the federal level, as an individual citizen. It is your right to do that. We definitely encourage you to do that. You're not going to be able to say that I'm writing on behalf of your company name, but absolutely, use email, make a phone call, use their representative's Twitter handle, which a lot of them do actively use now, and try and take advantage of some of those alternate ways of expressing your personal view on what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think to build on Meredith's point about social media, if you're not in a position of being in PR or coordinating with your lobbyist organization, there are still things you can do, right? Find out all of the handles of your company and follow them and understand what the company is saying publicly, and then help amplify those positions, right? We all have, all of us as individual consumers of social media understand how many likes or shares or retweets or quote tweets something gets, right? Well, our companies do too. They pay attention. And so the more amplification of a message that you can help extend, that's going to be more collateral about how you know, you're creating data feedback for the company about those items, and you have a reach and an audience that's outside of what your company does. So you can extend that message to, you know, the people who follow you on Twitter, or, you know, your friends and family, like your Facebook friends. So there are ways for you to amplify what the company is saying. If your company's not saying anything, then I encourage you to, like, you're at Unequal, right? You're here amongst friends, and you're here to gain these resources. Well, look at the other companies and see what other companies are doing. And if you can take those examples and then bubble them up and say, you know, Mars is doing this, IBM is doing this, Dell is doing this. Can we do something like this, or can we sign on? You know, start small, but when you bring those examples, log into Out and Equal and check the website for resources. You know, Out and Equal is about workplace equality and providing resources to companies. And those are ways that you can leverage someone else's experience. And so instead of having to go, you know, swim upstream, or, you know, create it from scratch, you know, look to what other companies have done and see if there's a company that looks a little bit like yours or has common interests in yours, who may be a little farther down the path, and see if you can nudge your company in that same direction.
Yeah, I think if I want to build on that point Sam just made, at least in DC, most of us federal lobbyists that work on these D&I issues, we all know each other. And yes, it's true that some companies are more active than others, but if you're coming from a firm that's not quite as active, you know, but you can get to your GR colleague, say, listen, you know, I know Meredith Singer in IBM's GR office, very active. Do you know her? Can you talk to her? Or, you know, at the risk of being flooded, you can connect with me on LinkedIn and say, oh, I'm from this company. Do you know my GR colleague from my own company? Could you, you know, would you mind giving them a call or reaching out to them if you know who they are? And in some cases, I may know why the company has decided not to engage, especially if it's on LGBT plus policy issues, because I've been living and breathing this for the last few years. Sometimes I might not, but it is a fairly small community of us that focus specifically on this policy issue set. So don't be afraid to reach out and just say, do you know my colleague? Can you help me out here?
Another tiny build, and this is just building on something that Sam said, you know, if you have a company or part of a company that, you know, isn't particularly active here, do pay attention to what your peer set is doing. I mean, business thrives in the space of competition. So, you know, when we know that our peers, our competitors, or our customers are moving forward in a more progressive way on these issues, oftentimes being able to share that and share what it means to you. Can make a big difference.
Yeah, there's definitely so much strength in numbers right now, especially on LGBT related advocacy. I will tell you, I'm also very much involved in what IBM is now doing on behalf of our Black constituency and racial equality. And you better believe that I'm using the playbook that I created for our LGBT advocacy and employing that now on behalf of our Black constituency or on behalf of other constituencies at IBM. So, you know, there's a lot that we're learning and sharing.
Just a couple notes too from my kind of bird's eye perspective. So one is that Meredith's point about letters, like there is letter fatigue. And so I'm sure that I don't always get it right, but I do try to be judicious about when we pursue a letter and going, is that what's going to work the best? Sometimes our intel from a state partner is that's just going to piss them off. But if they get a few well-placed phone calls that are respectful, that will move the lieutenant governor or the Speaker of the House or the governor or whatever it is, committee chair. And so sometimes it's not happening because it's not the right tactic for that moment. Sometimes your company is not on it and they're doing a whole bunch of stuff that they probably won't ever even tell you about. It is a hard thing to get companies to do over and over and over again because there are so many layers. So I will just say, just because you don't see your company on it doesn't mean that they've abandoned you and their advocacy for you. There's lots of, I always tell the companies we work with, you know, we have lots of oars, and sometimes you'll row your oar one or another, and sometimes you won't. And that's why we work with so many businesses, because conditions are just different. Your company may be trying to ink a huge deal with the state government that requires not making the governor mad. And so for that moment, you've got to do that because that's jobs on the line. And so, sometimes folks will say that to me and I'll go, great, I'll stop pestering you and I'll go pester your friends. If there's any phone calls you can make to your peers and other companies, thanks, and definitely we'll talk about this in a minute too, but staying abreast of how to talk about the business case and what other companies are doing can be so helpful. The mantra I have now 6 years into this almost have gone by on everything we do, all these public things, as well as launching a coalition, is nobody wants to be first because that's really scary, but nobody's going to want to be last either. And so if we can build that momentum and you can show that momentum internally and go, look, it's companies that we fight against for talent, for example, or for customers or whatever it is jumping in on this, that makes the water a lot warmer for your employer to jump into.
I'd say if your company sees a lot of its clients named as part of a coalition or on a letter, that's a great business case to make for you and your organization to join in. Maybe it's a good transition into the next slide.
Great point. Okay, so we'll talk about coalitions, and we've had some questions here. So there's all kinds of business coalitions. These aren't all of them, but there are many, many state coalitions. Texas Competes has been around for almost 6 years, and then many of these other Competes have come in the wake of that and kind of taking their own state flavor on it. They tend to be structured where any business can join them as long as they're an employer in that state, even if you just have a few employees, for free. That at least I know that's true for Texas Competes, Ohio, Florida, One Communities, the Arizona thing. It's true for America Competes, which we try to look across all the states and keep folks informed. So that is free to do, but that joining has to come from someone who's authorized to join for the company. So you can't go to these websites and do it right now, and you'd get in trouble for doing that without getting approval. So please don't do that. But I can say, like with Texas, I will. If folks want to stay informed, I'll put you on my briefing list, even if you're not, a member of the coalition, because I'm happy for as many folks in the business community as possible to be abreast of what's happening. So do feel free to reach out to me and we can keep you posted on that kind of thing, on both the national, across the states and federally, and then also with my Texas hat on. Again, I'll just say these coalitions come about as doing a few functions, and then I'll turn over to you all to talk about your experience with them. From my perspective, number one is educate and across this whole thing, be as useful as humanly possible to these business folks. So, Meredith has a relatively unique job. Lisa does too, in looking at a suite of kind of D&I and sustainability issues. A lot of government affairs folks and businesses look across everything. And so all of these gazillion anti-LGBTQ bills and the relatively smaller number of non-discrimination bills that we see, that's a lot to keep track of when hasn't been in years past core to the business. So I take it as my job to cut through all of that and go, yes, there's a gazillion bills filed this year. Only these 5 are moving right now in these states, and we're going to keep you posted on them. This one's headed to this committee. This is the chair, really kind of like boiling that down to its essence so that these government affairs people don't have to feel like, shoot, am I missing something? Is something happening? And we're going to get caught unawares. I think North Carolina was a really difficult example when the bathroom bill passed so quickly there. And there was this huge outcry and demand for businesses to do something. And the business folks were like, we didn't know this was coming. That's kind of a nightmare scenario for business folks to be caught in. So we try to stay, as much as we can, stay ahead of what's happening, educate businesses about what's happening, and very clearly tie that into, is there a business case for what we're talking about? If we cannot see a data-driven business case, then we tell businesses that, because it builds better trust to say, this one is bad for LGBTQ people, but I can't see a way right now that it negatively affects business or that it would positively affect business. That changes over time. Like the fact that, I don't know, 6 years ago, I would not have said that we could make a strong business case for fighting bathroom bills, but then businesses made that a business case, and cancellation of tourism and all of those things created that data set that let us make that argument to businesses that this is in your best interest to talk about. And then the final thing, or final two things we do is messaging guidance, helping business-minded people understand how to talk about these issues from a business perspective without getting too far in the weeds on issues that they may not be, fully deeply comfortable with. Talking about, for example, attacks on transgender children's medical care. There's a lot of detail there that it can get really in the weeds very quickly. So we help train, here's how you can talk about it with your business voice. And then we create this like a la carte menu of opportunities. Here's some public things we're organizing. Here's some private things you can do. And here's how you can just follow along while you decide whether you're making a decision. And then all of that in the context of you're doing this with peers and competitors and friends. We're not asking you to do this by yourself. So
Yeah.
that's my context there. Would love to hear from, yes, Meredith.
I'm going to jump in there. As large companies, we all are members of the big national trade associations, and I would say probably members of the local business chamber of commerce in states and cities where we have a really big presence. But when you get an issue, say, like the bathroom bill or, employment-based non-discrimination, for example, that cuts across different major trade associations and different companies that are in different industry sectors. This is really where the role of the business coalition comes in. So it's an opportunity for all of the various stakeholders that are aligned in our objective to come together. And in some cases, it's very formalized, where we end up contributing money and hiring a leader who's going to manage the coalition like a brand new organization. And in some cases, it's a bit more ad hoc. But there's a really critical need for some sort of organizational structure that allows all of these disparate stakeholders to come together. And then that only amplifies our lobbying muscle, so to speak. And it was because we did that in Texas with law enforcement and tourism and energy companies and telecom and food and IT and you name it, that we were finally able to really get the attention of the leadership of the state government. And we were able to stop them from moving forward on the bathroom bill. And we're trying to do the same thing right now at the federal level as it relates to getting more support for the Federal Equality Act. There, of course, are LGBT-oriented organizations. There are companies like ours that are very supportive of the Equality Act, but there also are a whole host of other trade associations that support the Equality Act, but wouldn't necessarily go to Capitol Hill and sit in a meeting with a member of Congress and say, this is one of our top priorities. So just wanted to let you know that there is such a critical role for these business coalitions. And I think that having them also opens up more opportunities for each of you as members of different business resource groups to get involved, because with more organizations allows more opportunities for different kinds of engagement that are well below the federal lobbyist level and the official level.
And I'll jump in maybe with just a little bit more about the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance. And it builds a little bit on what Meredith was saying. So, Mars and the other companies that are part of the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance have, lots of big multi-stakeholder business coalitions. And in some cases, when those coalitions get too big, you begin to be pulled down by the laggards, particularly if you want to be among the leaders. And so the reason that Mars and Nestle and Unilever and Danone came together to form the Sustainable Policy Alliance in 2019 was we knew that we needed to be doing more advocacy on social and environmental issues in the US. We knew that a collective was going to be more powerful than any of our actions individually, but we also knew that we had so many things that were similar to one another. We are at the core agriculturally focused companies. We are at the core consumer-facing companies. So, this notion of people really matters, and connecting to people both inside our businesses and outside the business also matter. And so the brilliance, I think, of the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance is that it has brought together a small group of companies that share a similar vision to do one thing, and that is advocacy. So the one thing that we do together, and we work very closely in meetings on both social agendas and environmental agendas, is decide where we can collectively have a voice that's going to matter and that's going to break through. And, you know, since 2019, a lot of that voice has been focused on issues related to inclusion and diversity. And, you know, knock on wood, I think, you know, we've had the good fortune of being able to break through in a number of states and in collaboration with, you know, a number of organizations like America Competes.
You know, Lisa, that's a great tip off to the fact that you can do this type of work inside the company as well. So this type of coalition building also applies to cross ERG, BRG work, right? So, you know, we are here as members of LGBTQ, ERG, BRGs, but, you know, at Dell, we have double-digit numbers of ERGs, and it's everything from, you know, True Abilities to the Black Employees Network, and I think I just messed up that name. I know one of my Dell counterparts can put it in the chat so that it's correct and accurate. To the Veterans Organization, to Women in Tech, and those coalitions are also really strong to have collaboration of what's working, what's not working, where do you have common needs and common ground. And, you know, and in instances such as racial justice, it was really, really powerful this June that we turned to the Black Networking Alliance, and it was Pride Month, and said, you know, what do you need? How can we help? And putting together those types of building those bridges and actively building those bridges and connecting, you get the same types of results that, you know, individual companies do, bonding together to form coalitions. So it's worth investigating those internally as well as externally.
Okay, I just want to amplify that. That is such a fantastic point, Sam, because I know other constituency leads that I work with within the company are asking me, what do we do to get more involved in advocacy? And now I'm able to say to them, well, let me put you in touch with our LGBT leaders or the BRG leaders in Austin, Texas, for example. Have them share with you things that they've done and things that they have found to be very helpful. So we can definitely learn internally from each other. So I'm really glad you made that point.
I'm just going to advance us along looking at time. We've touched on a lot of this, so we can do more of it. And it's great that we're having an ongoing discussion here. But in talking about what folks can do who aren't government affairs people per se. And so we'll just kind of go through these one at a time. And so one of them is make the business case. And there's been a couple of questions here of, well, where do we get that? And actually that question is making me think about what I need to do better to provide that resource for folks who aren't my core audience running America Competes and Texas Competes. We've got lots of information about what is the business case for a business to care about and speak up on issues of non-discrimination, LGBTQ non-discrimination. And so being equipped with that and being able to talk about it and say, you know, not only here's my personal story, which matters a lot, but here is why this matters to the business, and here's the data behind it. It's just like any other project you might take forward to your executives or your manager or whatever, that if you're armed with, here's why this is a good idea for the business, you're gonna be taken, I think, more seriously. And twin that with your own personal story makes it so powerful. So all I'll say about that is I would love to I imagine I can get panelist information, I'm hoping, and reach out to you all after the fact, and would commit myself to sharing some of those basics about what that business case is and what that data looks like, so that I can help equip you with that, because I think that's something I haven't been doing super well. But I wondered if any of you all had any other thoughts about how to help people make this business case. And I'm just going to stop sharing for a second while you do that, because I want to go grab a link to share in the chat.
Who wants to go first? You know, I know it's hard if you're not part of, say, the corporate structure of the company to make the business case. And I would say that we don't expect you to come to the table with all the facts and figures and numbers and everything. But, being able to really share your personal experience and what makes you feel comfortable coming to work, what is it that allows you to be able to put your best self forward and dedicate, your time and effort to the business of the company, I think is what helps, is something that you can tangibly do to help make that business case. We have often said within IBM, we don't want people to feel like they've got to look over their shoulder and worry about whether or not, it's safe for them, either physically safe or psychologically safe for them to come to work. We want them to be able to focus on doing their jobs and feel like they can just be themselves. And so to the extent to which you do have P&L or you are, involved in some money-making part of the business, that is part of developing the business case in my mind.
I would echo that, Meredith, that, when there's frequently times where I will read a news story or see a breaking news headline and my response is like, this is awful. But translating how this is awful to specifically how it will impact me is really the primary business case that I'm responsible as an employee for elevating within the company to let Dell know how it impacts me. And that's the same for each of us is, and it's, if you're uncomfortable making that in a public way, or you don't feel like you can disclose that for whatever reason to your direct leadership, or you need to do that in an anonymous way. Most companies have a way to submit through either an ombudsman or an HR portal or an EAP portal that will allow you to raise concerns. And while you might not think it directly connects the dot, you're still providing a data point to your company, and every interaction is helpful.
Just popping back in to say I've included in the chat a number of links. So if y'all would navigate over there, we did an op-ed in Harvard Business Review. That was kind of my omnibus, okay, I need to put this all in one place about why businesses are being more vocal. So it's a little out of date. It's about 1.5 years old, but it includes a lot of these data links to sources and data points. And then I included a couple of other links as well, where if you are a data nerd like me, you can spend many hours enjoying yourself. Okay, so here's another telling your story internally and externally. And again, I'll just chime in and quick and say that I've heard that from a lot of business folks, that both people telling their story, I mean, that is always very powerful. That's internally to lawmakers as an individual citizen, but then also, showing appreciation when you do see your company doing something is very powerful. So I've heard that from a lot of DE&I people and a lot of government affairs people that, when we spoke up, we had this outpouring of gratitude and support and cheerleading from both LGBTQ employees and allies in the company and parents of LGBTQ kids in the company. And that can add a lot of kind of steam to the engine of going, okay, let's do this more. We didn't get blowback from our employees. We didn't get boycotted out in the public. And they love it. And that is a great retention tool for us to keep our wonderful team members that we want to keep and not lose. So telling that story and also telling how it has positively impacted you to see your company stand up for your rights can be really powerful tools.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if you have a senior executive sponsor whose role it is to be the executive sponsor for your internal LGBT community, send that individual even just an email or a Slack, or utilize whatever platforms and tools you have within the company. You could send your chief diversity officer also just a personal note too, because they do respond to that. And then if they get critical mass, then that's going to filter down. And so at that point, then it might be determined that some further action or some action that hasn't yet been taken needs to be taken.
And just to build on that, I think, probably in my career, at least, I don't think I've ever witnessed a time where topics related to fairness and justice and equity have been more relevant and more present in executive conversations. So I would just say that I think Meredith is right. Find a way to make your story part of that dialogue.
Oh, I'm doing a million things at once here. I'm going to reshare. I just went over to Pathable to throw those links there as well, based on a request. So as I figure out, again, how to share my screen, the next item that we were going to talk about is watch what peer companies are doing. So do y'all have any advice about how to go about doing that so that in a non-combative way, you can go internally and say, hey, I see our competitors are doing this. That might make it easier for us to do so.
I mean, this week is a great opportunity to understand what other companies are doing and do friendly research. Everyone is sharing because they want to share, so there's nothing, troublesome about that. Social media is a great place. Find a great newsletter. I think I follow a couple of journalists who specifically cover the tech sector, and there's one journalist in particular who does a lot of intersectional work, and so I find following them to be really helpful of understanding what's going on, both of from a technology perspective as well as how technology is intersecting with equity and justice and what's going and environmental equity and climate change and such. So those are a couple of ways that I go about understanding what peer companies are doing.
I'll add to something kind of in the weeds, but if you're a researcher and like to dig for things like I do, you might enjoy this. So each of us who are registered as federal lobbyists must file lobbying reports every quarter with the federal government, and those lobbying reports are public. And so you could very easily find the lobbying reports for your own company, which will show who is working on what issues and which bills and which topics they're focused on. And if you want to, you could do a little searching for some of the peer organizations in your industry sector or some of the bigger name firms and be able to find out exactly who is working on that. Now, I'm not quite sure how that works at the state level, but it's very public information at the federal level, and each of us has to file our report every single quarter.
I did just rethrow a plug into the chat for our brand new little baby America Competes Twitter account. So it doesn't have a ton of followers, but I've got a wonderful colleague who tries to, at Freedom for All Americans, who stays on top of, anything that we see in the news or anything that we know that's happening that's public and can be shared. We'll share there what we see companies doing in this space. So if you want to take our follower count from like 2 to a couple hundred, we would welcome you. What else? Oh, this is all Sam. Well, no, this doesn't have to all be Sam, but I'm going to toss this over to Sam first, since Sam has personal experience with starting an internal task force. And I'm just keeping track of time. We've got about 10 minutes to go.
Yeah, so when I transitioned to Dell, I did not know any other trans folk at Dell. And of course, we saw on that chart the craziness that was going on with bad bills and at the time, and so I was hyper aware of what was going on, and a couple of organizations that I was involved with really put their arms around me, and the Pride ERG at Dell was one of those organizations. And so I found not just a place to be supported and helpful, but I also found resources and people who were plugged in and knew how to get things done. And I just started talking about this trans task force. Like we need a trans task force. We needed a coalition of trans folk, and I want to be inclusive here under the trans and trans, gender diverse, gender expansive, and non-binary folk to I needed those resources, right? I needed to connect. I wanted to connect and find others, and I wanted everyone to feel as if we had a voice and a way to aggregate those voices. So this was really a microcosm of everything we've been talking about today, which was coalition building and going out and finding people who had like experiences and had like needs. I didn't want to feel alone. I didn't want anyone else to feel alone. And I wanted to make the experience of transitioning at Dell better. Not because it was bad for me, but just because I felt like why not make it better? There are things we can always improve upon. And I heard from other people that there were challenges. And so that was just something that I talked about it enough. I think I just basically talked it into existence of, I named it and we talked about it and said we were doing it, and then we just did it. And soon other people were talking about it, and, and that's how the task force was born. And kudos to everyone who has raised it up and supported it and has been there to help us navigate what it's like to try to get something. Like, we all knew what we needed, but learning how to navigate inside a company and how everything works can be daunting and challenging if that's not your core job and you don't know how those things work, especially in a company that's as large and diverse as Dell. So that's been super important, is to have those stakeholders who already knew how the process worked to buy in and help us navigate as well.
That's awesome. Okay, I'm going to forge ahead because we only have a few minutes left. I know we want to talk a little bit about 2021. Stay on top of legislative movement. So any advice there beyond what we've talked about, which I know we've touched on this quite a bit.
I think we hit the highlights on this one.
Yeah, I think so too. Okay, and use your own voice. Okay, we've talked about that. So let's go on to final, and I'll stop screen share now. Discussion and 2021 priorities. We've had a lot of robust discussion in the chat. Please keep it going for the next few minutes. But 2021 priorities and what you all are looking at across the states and at the federal level. And of course, this has to involve discussion of what's happening now through November 3rd and however long that process takes.
Yeah, well, I'll start. For us at IBM, one of our very top priorities is passage of the Equality Act. And that's the federal bill that Jessica described, which will provide affirmative non-discrimination protections beyond just the employment space, but to so many different areas of life. And so we're going to be putting a lot of muscle behind that, depending as well on what the makeup of the Congress is and who's in the White House. But we know for a fact that the bill will be reintroduced early on in the House of Representatives, given that we don't think that the House is going to flip. And, if the Senate flips, and even if it doesn't, we're going to see some of our Democratic friends in the Senate reintroduce that bill right away. So I think that we've got the benefit of the Bostock decision to work in our favor, because given that we now have Bostock, there is, we think, less of an opportunity for some of the more conservative members of Congress to oppose support for something like this. And, we'll have to see how the elections play out across the states. But passage of the Equality Act, priority number one.
And in the meantime, we'll keep working to build pro-equality majorities, which is how I tend to think of it as a bipartisan person who works in a bipartisan space. The Equality Act passed the House with bipartisan support, 8 Republican votes. It currently has a Republican co-sponsor in the Senate, although she's in a competitive race, Susan Collins of Maine. In Texas, a non-discrimination bill will be filed for next session that already has 2 Republican joint authors helping write the bill. So this work can be done, and business is a super important part of doing that, and thinking about pro-equality majorities and helping folks get to a place where they can support something that is supported by a lot of their constituents. So don't forget our friends on both sides of the aisle where good conversations can be had.
I think from both a Mars perspective and a Sustainable Food Policy Alliance perspective, like Meredith, the Equality Act is certainly where we will be leaning in, continuing to lean in, and fingers crossed that's going to happen in a meaningful, measured, at pace way in 2021.
And in the meantime, you know, coalitions like ours, both Texas and America Competes National Coalition, will keep an eye on, and we are continuing to educate folks about these bills targeting transgender children. If any of your businesses would like to organize one of those, I will make time in my calendar to do that. If you can get me a critical mass of folks, including some senior folks who can, you know, be willing to listen in on that. We have a presentation prepared that I've been doing for business folks to help them understand what these bills are, how they harm kids, how they harm business interests. So you can find me at jessica@freedomforallamericans.org, and I'd be happy to try to do that for you, just so people can see what's coming and know how to talk about it, because we've had a lot of success with briefing business folks about those bills, which are really cruel and unnecessary. Sam, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, and then
Meredith,
I had one other thing to
please.
No, go Meredith, please.
Well, what I was going to add is, I know we didn't really touch too much on international issues, but one of my goals in 2021 is to continue to work with my international colleagues, at least within IBM and maybe externally, to continue to support marriage equality and non-discrimination protections for my global colleagues. You know, at IBM, we've got multiple hundreds of thousands of employees around the world. So we care about what's happening outside of the US as well as what's happening within, and being able to use the messaging and the approved positions to help my colleagues outside of the US support themselves and ensure that they feel comfortable and safe and can bring their whole selves to work is really going to be one of my top priorities next year. And finding other company peers to do that with as well.
I think parting words are for 2021. I'm also looking at international type of work streams as far as the task force and what we're working on at Dell. But I would encourage everyone to remember try to plug in, as uncomfortable as this year has been in many, many ways. There's been an awful lot of enfranchisement of voters and awareness. And I would encourage everyone to remember this energy and carry it forward. And by being engaged in legislative awareness and process and activities, you know, all across every year, not when it's just a presidential election year, will help forward the process of equality for every person. Because when voices are heard, we all make progress. So stay engaged and vote.
All the way down your ballot to the bottom.
All the way.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. We appreciate your engagement and so many people attending this. It's just incredible. Kind of a vote in favor of virtual formats because so many people can attend. Thank you so much, Sam and Meredith and Lisa. You all are wonderful allies and friends. We appreciate you so much. And Marilu, thank you for keeping this going. And thank you all for your grace with my technological savvy.
Fabulous moderation, Jessica. Great to be a part of this.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Such
Thank
an honor
you.
to be with you guys today. Thank you.
Take
care.
You all.